Here is Van Dieman's Pink Radish. And obviously, with radishes in the name, we know they are huge fans of Fraggle Rock. This is a pink with a distinctive red lean, very evident in the swatch, which looks much more as a red than a pink. But the writing samples are certainly pink. This is a slight tone shift as papers change, enough to be easily noticeable without a direct comparison. It does shade from pink to red, a red close to red in the swatch. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performs less than optimal, as we do get some feathering. Admittedly, not too bad though, but it shows its aggression getting very deep into the page, making this not the best for students. I wouldn't suggest it. The tone of pink is very well done, and it does shade well. I just don't see this as an ink I need a bottle of, but that's just me.
The pen for today is a Lamy 2000. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
This pink does have that distinctive red lean to it, but is still a very nice pink with no feathering, with no spread, with some shading going on that's very well. It's not the smallest amount. If we look at smallest, the S and the T are a little bit darker than the rest of the word. It shows up much better in counterexample right next to it, where most of the counter, the cown, is a bit lighter. The ter lightens up a little bit, gets a little lighter during the AM of example. The PLE at the end does get a whole lot darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Van Dieman's makes more than just this one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Van Dieman's.
Here is Van Dieman's Blackberry Jam.
Here is Van Dieman's Midnight Sky.
Here is Van Dieman's My Fair Audrey. Here is Van Dieman's Cradle Mountain Gray.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here the tone is noticeably lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, barely shades at all. You might have to think about it when you look at think on the third line, where the H and the K are a little bit darker than the T and the IN. For the most part, we get no kind of real shading, just a very well executed pink on the page. Looking at the back of the page, it's not the ghosting of the writing that's the problem. None of these spots in this very aggressive ink, as it gets very deep into the page very regularly, but they did not bleed through to touch the page underneath.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here the tone is noticeably lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine, the same lighter tone that we had on the Portage, which makes me say this is not a translucent ink. It's probably an opaque ink that is being affected by the makeup of the paper, not the tone of the paper. It does feather quite regularly here. You do not have a problem finding it at all. It doesn't spread. It has the slightest bit of shading. It's the feathering to me that's a problem. I don't see this as a good combination. Looking at the back of the page, the feathering on the front makes a whole lot of sense when we see how aggressive it is. All of those aggressive spots are where feathering was occurring on the front. So this, while it didn't bleed through to the page underneath, is definitely not a good ink for this paper.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same lighter tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. There are a couple of moments of shading. The moments of shading I really don't care about. They're so minor, barely there. It does stand out against this quad rule without any kind of a problem. My eye keeps coming to analyze where I'm seeing a couple feathers. Very disturbing. so I'm going to have to take back the doesn't feather part. Looking at the back of the page, I'm going to go ahead and wind up circling a whole bunch because it gets very deep into the paper, an awful lot. This is a coated paper that normally doesn't have this kind of a problem. The fact that it's doing this is a bit of a warning sign to me about this ink.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more pink inks.
Here is Graf von Faber-Castell Yazakura. Here is Monteverde Rose Pink. Here is Private Reserve Rose Rage. Here is Sailor Mother Pink.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here the tone is a little bit lighter and flatter than it is on the Clairfontaine. Lighter and flatter is normal for this paper, so not a problem. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does shade better than it did on the Rhodia, not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but still doing very nice. It does stand out against the quad rule well enough here that I think if a student was using it, this could be a very good choice. Looking at the back of the page, there's no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Noodler's Concord Bream. Here is Colorverse Black Hole. Here is Diamine Ochre. Here is Diamine Gray.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone is noticeably lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. It does have a couple of tiny spots of some feathering going on. Those are not major. The amount of spread that's going is a little bit more than we normally see on 20-pound copy paper. That, to me, with the tiny bits of feathers that do occur, they are the tiniest bits of feathers. It's just when I get those two together, that's usually a no-go. Does it shade some? Sure. If you must point out some, look at must on the third line. The T is a little bit darker than the musts before. Looking at the back of the page, the ghosting's not a problem. The deeper penetration into the paper is, but that's normal for copy paper, so this back here just means you couldn't take notes here.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The medium to wet flow medium of the Lamy 2000 gives a really well done pink that also shades. Off camera, I tried this in a dry broad. The tone did lighten a little and it still shaded fairly well. I think the best version of this pink comes from a wet medium pen. It gives a bold but not screaming pink that shades fairly decently. And then the trash heap has spoken.